Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending where you're joining us today. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's research on interdisciplinary global studies roundtable discussion on governing artificial intelligence and governing with artificial intelligence. But before I introduce the roundtable itself and our esteemed guests, let me do a few housekeeping things, as this event coincides also with our annual RIGS event, which is a bit of a sort of business meeting that takes place twice a year, in the fall and in the spring. And for those who will be joining us, if you haven't heard of the event and you still would like to join us, I will send out the link right now and at the end of the session, as we will hold a regular Zoom meeting for the annual event. That said, participation is key despite the webinar format that we're using today. And so I would say, please use the Q&A function, and you can ask questions along the way. I'll try to keep an eye on unanswered questions and sprinkle them in as we go along, or as traditionally done in these events, we can certainly have a Q&A session after we wrap up the roundtable. Without further ado, though, let me say a few words now about this roundtable. And as the title indicates, we're trying to explore here the dual dimensions of AI governance, both the regulation of AI and the use of AI as a governance tool itself. Our featured speakers are Dr. Medlir Mema and Professor Christopher Lamont, who lead the AI governance program at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels, Belgium. And they will share their insights from their work at the forefront of this rapidly evolving field, drawing from their experience in foresight analysis, policy advising, and public engagement, including also their podcast, the Age of AI podcast. And I will also put this here into the link for those who are interested in potentially looking at, or rather looking at the website, but listening to the podcast. And so both of them, Medlir and Chris, will discuss key challenges and policy strategies for managing AI's global impact, while also leveraging its potential for better governance. A few words about our esteemed guest here. Dr. Medlir Mema is the head of the AI governance program at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. He used to be associate professor of political science at Tokyo International University in Japan. He holds a PhD in political science from George Washington University and a Master's of Arts in European Studies and International Economics from SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And his work explores how AI-enabled technologies are fundamentally reshaping policy development and governance structures worldwide. And you call it Professor Christopher K. Lamont is the deputy head of artificial intelligence program at the Global Governance Institute, or GGI, in Brussels. He's also a professor of international relations at Tokyo National University and a visiting senior researcher at the University of Tokyo's Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology, both, of course, in Japan. He holds a PhD in politics from the University of Glasgow and a Master's of Science in International and European Politics from the University of Edinburgh, and a Bachelor's of Arts in International Studies from Ole Miss. He's also, or was, a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Zagreb in Croatia and an RCUK postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ulster. With these brief introductions now, let's jump right into the gist and the crux of our roundtable today, and perhaps we can ease our listeners and our audience into sort of a bit of a backdrop, drawing from your Age of AI podcast. So perhaps, Chris, maybe you can start. How did this all come about? What's the genesis of sort of you dabbling into AI, given your IR background, but now adding AI to much of it, and then of course Medlir chime in as well.
Right. I mean, for the well, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Kurtz, for inviting us to this work roundtable. We're really delighted to be here to talk about the work of the Global Governance Institute, and also talk about the Age of AI podcast, which is soon to be coming on its 100th episode, which gives us time to reflect, I guess, on the origins of the podcast today. And it started really kind of in the height, I guess, in the early days of the pandemic, when Medlir was a colleague of mine here in Tokyo, and was teaching a class actually here at Tokyo International University on AI governance, as a senior seminar. And he came to me with the idea of a podcast. And for me, initially, I thought this sounds really interesting. Didn't know that much about podcasts, other than just like listening to them. But Medlir was incredibly enthusiastic about this project, and made a very good case for starting it. And I think one of the wonderful things about the podcast has been that it gave me at least an opportunity to speak with a lot of leading kind of scholars, but also kind of people who are working as engineers in AI, and kind of people who are working at this from the various different perspectives, either in business or law or policy, that really helped, in the early days, wrap my head around some of the developments that were taking place in the field. Because as you mentioned, my background, I started in transitional justice, during doing my PhD, and also in terms of earlier research. But I was becoming interested in how AI tools, and also how big data was transforming transitional justice processes, right? You have all this data that's out there, and I'm talking about kind of billions of frames of videos of atrocity, and how to grapple with that. So kind of the confluence of all these things a few years ago brought kind of me into this, with Medlir, of course, proposing the podcast. So Medlir.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris, for this. And again, Armand, thank you so much for the invitation today. It's really a wonderful opportunity for us. Um, I was actually in Albania through the 2010-2020 period, and while they're considering this question of how developing countries could actually make use of technological advancements to kind of leap over particular stages of development, so you don't have to like you're not condemned to repeat stages of development. And so I got into this literature on the third industrial revolution, of course, is the one traditionally associated with development, and then the fourth industrial revolution, which was this conversation just starting then, and then questions of labor transformation, workplace transformation, industrialization, emerging technologies, of course, AI being foremost among those, and then just thinking then through the implications of that. And then, of course, academics, part of the motivating question was what impact would emerging technologies and AI in particular have on our discipline as, international relations and political scientists. And so the early iteration actually of this podcast was IR in the age of AI, international relations in the age of AI. Because then we were thinking theoretically through this. So how does that impact theoretical paradigms and frameworks, but also how do these developments also impact the practice of international politics? And so that was the early iteration. Being in Japan at the height of COVID, it was actually a perfect both teaching kind of supplement for my students. So my students were actually involved early on. When we did the senior seminar, they were involved in designing this as part of their senior seminar project, preparing questions for guests as well. They participated in some of the early interviews as well. So it was a teaching tool, it was a learning tool, and also was a way for Chris and I to connect with a broader community at a time when we could not move, couldn't go anywhere. And so then get in touch with colleagues throughout the world. And so we'd like to think that the podcast itself is one that speaks with a global voice. So we have representation in terms of participation, both listeners as well as guests from all around the world. So we're very proud of that. It doesn't speak with one particular accent. It has a global accent. And so we think that that's actually a strength of the podcast. But also, again, whenever we bring people in, it's with an eye towards educating ourselves and others about what's not necessarily the cutting edge, but again, the implications, much like our conversation today, for governance, both AI in government and as well as the governance of AI. And so since then, over the last 5 years, we have moved the podcast and our kind of our research space within the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. And so there, we'll probably talk more about some of these programs, but we do these annual trainings on AI governance. We do roundtables, workshops, commentaries, regular briefs, and we have developed actually a very robust research program within the Global Governance Institute on AI governance in various areas. So I'll stop with that, and I'm sure we can discuss more in the course of the hour.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris and Medlir, for providing such rich context. And before I jump right into sort of the next set of questions here, just a shout out to both of you, because as you know, Montclair is certainly a research university, but it comes from sort of a teaching background. It used to be a normal school where we, at the early turn of the 20th century, we're training our teachers and instructors, right? And so to really embrace a project here in terms of the podcast and include students and make sure that they are familiar with these tools and that they really are on board in terms of moving this ahead. And the trajectory, it started out at TIU, where both of you met, and now it's located, I mean, virtually it's in the web space or digital space, but it certainly has its pied à terre in Brussels now, and that is quite telling. And I think that leads me to this initial question of that framing and the dual dimension that we've decided we will call out or name our discussion, our roundtable discussion today. And could you help us a bit define what the distinction exactly is between governing artificial intelligence, right? The governance of that new technology, as well as governing with artificial intelligence, right? Medlir mentioned sort of the government are using that tool increasingly, and there's no sector that is being spared. And so maybe both of you, maybe we'll go back to Chris, start with a couple of examples. You can certainly draw from your experience at the Institute in Brussels, but also from your own research, right? Chris, you mentioned transitional justice and how AI has sort of transformed also a whole field of study. So maybe we'll start with Chris and then go back to Medlir.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question and kind of highlighting the title of today's workshop. And I guess when we have a program in Brussels at the GGI called the AI Governance Program, and it addresses both the kind of the question of AI governance. And so AI governance looks at the question of how to govern these technologies. And so it brings you into the world of kind of looking at risk, mitigating risks associated with these technologies. And concrete examples would be, for example, we were both here in Japan. About 10 years ago, Japan started kind of getting involved with in advancing within the framework of the OECD kind of principles and best practice guidelines for the governance of AI, with an eye to some of the risks that are inherent in these tools. And other examples from other parts of the world would include, of course, the EU AI Act, right, which was adopted as a landmark piece of legislation within the European Union. But also, if you think about kind of the implications in terms of human rights, think about some of these kind of risks, and kind of to put kind of a little bit more kind of flesh on what I'm talking about, you might think about some of the due process risks associated with AI tools being used in justice processes. So, for example, we've had guests on the podcast highlight this very early on, that if a AI tool says you your DNA kind of from this mixture analysis is a match, you can't cross-examine that tool. And the kind of the underlying algorithms might be proprietary, right? And so if you think about the human rights implications within the Council of Europe, there is the world's first human rights treaty on governing artificial intelligence having emerged from that. But of course, on the one hand, you have risk, and on the other, there's opportunity, right? And so this is another way of perhaps thinking about that, is that it's not just a question of governing AI, but also the way that AI tools can assist in the project of governance. And Medlir mentioned his interest starting kind of more than a decade and a half ago in Albania, and thinking about kind of interests among Albanians and how artificial intelligence and emerging technologies could kind of kickstart a developmental process. And in fact, we find that resonates here in kind of not in kind of the broader kind of region of East Asia. When you think about when you talk to people in, for example, Philippines or Indonesia about artificial intelligence, largely it's seen not from the perspective of risk, but from the framework perspective of development, right? And so if you think about some of these tools in relation to the governance of AI, you might think about, for example, kind of e-government kind of efficiency in terms of state interaction with citizens, right? So if you live in a state with kind of a high propensity, like high levels of corruption, where kind of bribery might be a everyday experience, then not having to interact with a human in that context, right? You might see as an added plus, right? In terms of kind of being able to get a particular service, or being identified as being in need of a particular service through these types of tools. But it's not just that. You might think about, for example, in urban environments and urban planning, there's all sorts of examples where you can see artificial intelligence, because it's kind of a general purpose technology, playing a role in assisting or augmenting, if you want to think about it that way, governance processes. Medlir, do you have something to?
No, yeah, no, thank you. And maybe it's easier for me to start from the top again. And I appreciate, and thanks, by the way, Arnaud, for sharing also the website. The website that you just shared, the link is actually the training that's coming up this June in a month's time in Brussels. It's both online and in person, so people can take a look at that if they want to know more about these topics. And it's exactly as Chris described it, an attempt, our attempt at least, of addressing this question of AI governance. And so it's the first half of your question. So when I think of AI governance, generally, we split in those two different kind of paradigms that you just pointed out. One is efforts to regulate the development and deployment of AI technologies. So that's governing AI. And then the integration of AI tools within governance structures to improve state functions, governing with AI. And so if we're to think about governing AI, here's like all policies, laws, frameworks established to ensure that AI technologies are developed and used in ways that uphold, again, Chris pointed out, principles of safety, fairness, accountability, fundamental rights. So whenever we think about AI governance, we think about what impact that will have, and also whether we can build that within, these governance frameworks. Of course, we can think of this in terms of short term and a long term. So the more practical aspect of that is like, well, how does this particular legislation, affect, or how does it uphold principles of safety and fairness? But in the long term, we tend to think also about existential safety risks or existential risks for humanity, right? So what kind of values do we embed within AI training modules, but as well as AI governance frameworks, so that humanity is actually safe, right? We're not actually, kind of just sleepwalking towards our own kind of extinction. And then the second, so a great example of this, the one that people would be familiar with, would be the EU AI Act, right? So last year, now it's in effect within Europe, which is a risk-based kind of framework for governing, for AI governance. You have others that are also at state level, of course, private. So state of California here, Utah, Colorado, they have actually AI acts and legislation. The U.S. Congress here in the United States tried to pass, or at least proposed, over 200 different pieces of legislation on governing, right, on AI governance. None of them eventually passed, but we know that there is bipartisan will, at least here in the United States, to go in this direction. Of course, China, and we'll talk more about this, has led the way, I'd argue, in terms of governance, at least domestically, a very intricate kind of web of governance structures. And then, of course, you have governing with AI. And one thing that I'd add here to what Chris said is that oftentimes when we think about governing AI with AI, we think about governments governing with AI. And I think Chris hinted this at the very end. We've had some fascinating conversations with people about how we can use AI in the public space, right? So when we're talking about governing with AI, it's not just governments governing with AI, but it's also, other actors, including civil society actors, citizens, right? Governments can tap into AI, the wisdom of the crowds or hive intelligence, to get the pulse of the society, of the public square, and by doing so, get a sense of, where the public sentiment is. And I'd argue that's actually a superior way of governing than what we have right now, because it actually, instead of asking either or kinds of questions, having 0-1 types of outcomes, you actually get a sense of where most of the public is. And so then you work on areas of common agreement, right? Things that we commonly agree on, rather than how do you feel about this? And then you have a majority kind of like type of rule, but rather where does the population want us to go? And then you go and you govern on basis of those kinds of views. And so those are perhaps the two ways that I would address that particular question.
Excellent to both of you. This is a great start into delving into this issue, and there is already a question from the audience, which will I bring up in a little bit, but I want to dig a little deeper, because I think this nice juxtaposition of governing with, right, integrating it, but also knowing how to regulate it, that both of you have mentioned, brings about, again, and I want to dig deeper into the EU AI Act, but it brings about a question that I worked on like 20 years ago, and that falls within this modernist approach of we're moving forward with technology, and we all are aware, familiar with the Green Revolution in agriculture in the 1960s and 70s, which brought about then problems of pesticides and monocultures, right? And then the next, which was sort of a quantum leap for society, but it was sort of a small step in terms of technological advances, is gene splicing has been done in conjunction with sort of the Green Revolution, then, which led eventually to sort of this whole genetically modified agro-business and complex, right? And so to make a long comment or a long question short, what happened in terms of Monsanto and the North American complex in the 90s and early 2000s compared to Europe was sort of this push from North America on the global south and also towards Europe. How did Europe respond? And this is what Medlir mentioned in terms of sort of this risk management, right? Europe immediately said, we enforce the precautionary principle, so we are risk averse. We want to know what the public, what the long-term consequences will be. Well, it turns out that the moratorium that the EU put in place was certainly under the auspices of protecting consumers and society. But with a little deeper digging, one found out that Europe also wanted to protect its markets, right? So this is the private sector, and the moratorium then had sort of was a double-edged sword, right? It was to catch up with the R&D that one was behind, yet also, of course, with the positive side effect of then protecting potentially consumers. And so my question to both of you here is, can you tease out a bit the interplay between regulating and integrating, right? And so certainly the act, at first, when one thinks about this, is in terms of protecting privacy, right? Data of consumers, data of individuals. And we've seen, when I haven't looked at it more closely in recent months, but when I ran a seminar on this, we had a long debate on notably that very issue. And it'll be really nice to see and hear from you how sort of regulators in Brussels walk that fine line between sort of the lobby structure, which is less, I'd say, developed, but exists also in Europe in terms of pushing for protectionism, right? And when we look at the current trade wars that are happening around the globe, I mean, protectionism is the new normal in terms of the zeitgeist, right? So maybe use these examples. You both are sort of dabbling in US territory as well as Asia and Europe. So it'd be really nice to put your feelers out and provide us with a bit more insights in terms of that interplay and what that really means, right? Is that act that the EU passed really fundamentally about protecting rights, or is it at the same time also a bulwark against sort of the Chinese as well as the American influence in that field? And either way, who wants to jump in? Is Chris?
This is a really good question, Arno, because you're bringing together kind of three elements here, and that's kind of the regulation, regulations relationship with innovation, but also regulations relationship with potentially kind of protectionism as well. And I think when answering this question, it's good to kind of bundle together some of these big pieces of legislation that have come out of Brussels. You might think about the GDPR, right? As you mentioned, in terms of privacy, but also the Digital Markets and Digital Services Act that also are there, in addition to the EU AI Act. And of course, kind of on one level, there's one debate, right? Whereas you do have kind of the kind of mostly US big tech companies, but also some Europeans arguing that this regulation is raising the compliance costs on them and therefore making it more difficult for potentially, in kind of the European case, smaller actors or smaller firms to enter this sphere, but also it is potentially kind of raising the prospect of gargantuan fines, right, against kind of large US tech or social media platforms. And so you have the debate between kind of regulation and innovation on the one hand. When you think about kind of protectionism, though, and I think this is interesting because you make some interesting kind of historic analogies there. So one, you have to remember that if you look at kind of the US tech industry does not just dominate, is not just a dominant player in the US, it's dominant globally. Right. So and you have to understand that from a European, but also kind of from a perspective here in Japan. If you're a business here in Japan and you're looking for cloud services, and you're looking for kind of these other things, right? In terms of a lot of the services that are provided by US providers, that there isn't really a domestic equivalent. And so you've had kind of movements in kind of both places where you have increasing kind of conversations around notions like digital sovereignty. What would digital sovereignty look like? How do you kind of build that up? And kind of to what extent do these pieces of legislations either kind of stymie or accelerate that process domestically? And so in relation to the kind of the question that you're asking, I think there are a couple things that we should be aware of here. And one of the challenges is often that policymakers working on regulating the AI space are often faced with an information asymmetry, right? They're not the engineers, they're not the designers, and usually that's in the hands of the tech industry. So if kind of the big players in AI say, we need billions of dollars worth of kind of data centers and electricity supplies to fuel those data centers for kind of the next big advancement in AI, then it's difficult to push back against that. Although you saw with the kind of the emergence of DeepSeek from China, right, questions being raised as to kind of, is that really the case, right? Can kind of CPUs be used more efficiently, right, than are being used? Is that perhaps the answer there? So these things are all kind of part of the mix, and it's difficult to answer this now because you do see pushback from the US against Europe. And the question is as to how effective will the EU AI Act be actually in practice? And also kind of will the EU stand behind kind of the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act that have been adopted in the context of deepening trade turbulence with the US?
Yeah. Well, thank you for setting that up, Chris. I think one thing about the EU AI Act, and then I want to get into a more general kind of conversation about this tension, Arno, that you were talking about, um, is that at least my understanding, in reading of the development of the EU AI Act, is the conversations about it started way before, and I'm going to bring a date here up that I think our listener, participants here, the audience here will remember in November of 2022, which is when, ChatGPT, I think 3.0, was it, Chris? 3.5, actually kind of burst on the scene and everybody just started freaking out and we had all these articles. But up to that time, the topic, I mean, because AI is not new, right? We are in the fourth wave of AI technological development. There's been springs and there've been winters, and we are now in this kind of blooming of this. And there's people anticipate that we may go into yet another winter where things may actually, because we just don't have the ability to move on beyond the next kind of like frontier. And so when conversations about what now is known as the EU AI Act began, when they started, they were not about the AI, right? They were mostly about the digital technologies, about internet and everything else. And so then in November 2022, all of a sudden, there was this infusion of interest about it. And the reason I highlight this because I don't think that the EU AI Act itself was intentionally created to govern AI, right? And primarily AI, although eventually it kind of morphed into that. But also by the time, and this is the nature of negotiations within the European Union, but by the time the act passed, some of the technological kind of advancements that had been made already rendered the act itself moot. And so it's hard to judge now the transformation, at least the positioning with regards to AI Act by various countries. My sense is that the initial instinct was about consumer protection, number one. So that's the motivation. And secondly, it was about norm setting. I mean, we joke about this all the time, but we talk about how, in the world of technology, China has the data, United States has the technology, and EU has the regulation, has the norms, right? That's kind of like the division of labor, and it's worked in the past. So Chris mentioned the GDPR, right? I mean, the EU has what we know now as the Brussels effect, right? When something takes place in the European Union, because of the market pool, because of the regulatory kind of like, weight that the EU has, those norms tend to diffuse throughout the world. And that's been very successful. And that's, I mean, the GDPR now it's kind of the standard throughout the world. And when EU regulators kind of like agreed on the EU AI Act, there was an expectation that the same success that they met with GDPR, they would meet with the EU AI Act. And what happened was that it was just basically just crickets, right? Just chirping and nothing else. Nobody took on the model of the EU AI Act, despite EU's efforts, to diffuse those norms throughout the world, which meant then that over the last year and a half, European actors, in particular states, and here France has led the way, has looked around and said, well, if nobody's going to take on these stringent regulations that we have, then maybe we need to rethink this because we are going to lose the game, right, in terms of technological advancement. And so France made a point of underlining this in February when you had the meeting in Paris. And instead of calling this an AI safety summit, they actually call it an AI action summit. And they were keen on emphasizing this because when we were in at the UN Summit of the Future in September of last year in New York, I'm going to call him the France tech ambassador. Somebody mislabeled the upcoming event as a safety summit. He said, no, it's not a safety summit, it's an action summit. The point here being that we want to move beyond these restraints that we built into the AI Act, and we want to actually favor innovation and development and technological kind of investment rather than regulation. And so there is this sense, and I'd argue that if we're going to talk about this language of winters, we are now into regulatory winter. As we look across the board, Chris and I just led a conversation on autonomous weapon systems just last month in Brussels, so actually the beginning of April in Brussels. And the consensus, at least, Chris, you can correct me on this, but is that it's very important we have these conversations on governance on autonomous weapon systems. It's important that we keep these conversations going, but also we need to be realistic about the likelihood of these, at least for the time being, of these actually becoming law or countries coming together and just kind of like holding hands and going kumbaya on this. And so I think the sense here is that the regulatory framework is thinning out. It's not just in the United States, it's in Europe as well and across the world. And more emphasis is on technological advancements and investing in technology. And you can see this, by the way, also in the global South. Africa is leading the way in all kinds of discussions, debates about this. In Latin America, there's conversations about this. And of course, Chris and I have worked quite a bit closely with people in the Middle East and Central Asia, and where there's a lot of desire for actually moving into this space. And the language of AI governance isn't what we think about when we think about governance, but it's about how do we use AI both to help us in terms of finding efficiencies in government, but also how do we bring a lot of investment in the country so that we can use AI to actually develop these countries economically.
Excellent. Thank you to the both of you here. This is very rich and very helpful in terms of expanding my initial question here. And I think both of you hit the nail on the head here in terms of what balance do we have to strike in terms of innovation, right? You don't want to be left behind, but then also the public common good, right? The protection of what are the potential challenges in terms of harmful consequences or impacts, right? You mentioned autonomous weapons. That is a big discussion. And of course, no sovereign state would have any sort of impediments or restrictions when it comes to trying to protect national territory and populations from potential foreign or external threats, right? And so that rekindles that conversation about national security and to what extent then AI is certainly also a big hot button issue in our defense field, right? But I also wanted to, and maybe we'll shift our conversation. We can certainly come back to the defense parts, the security parts, because both of you have dabbled, thanks to your background in international relations, maybe get back there as well. But I wanted to look into, and also in view of finding an answer to the question that David Axelrod, an economist at the School of Business, Feliciano School of Business here at Montclair, has, and I want to prep this in terms of, because you mentioned the global South, you mentioned with the opportunities that are Asia, Africa, Latin America, right? But I think the biggest leap of faith that people have to do is certainly, do we trust this, right? And the whole debates about neo-colonial implementations again in terms of well, by who was it developed? Will we have agency and ownership, right? But then, for instance, when we think about how little hardwired internet connections exist in many developing countries, but how well countries were able to use cell phone technology to pay their bills and now to really regulate their daily lives is fascinating, right? When we look at now AI technology, it requires the hardware, right? And the hardware investments are not cheap, as you mentioned earlier, right? And so one question that Dax had here in this regard was whether AI-assisted governance could really lead to a bifurcation between those wealthy enough to afford the tangible, for instance, legal systems, courts, lawyers, etc., and those with little resources. Will they then basically accept AI as an arbiter? So this is, again, he used the case system and justice system here, but I think that could be applied to any technology, right? That you look into. So any thoughts on that, right? This this heavy investment. You mentioned the FDIs, Medlir, but Chris, we want to maybe lead the way in terms of what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very important question, and thank you for it, because we can't talk about AI and the hype surrounding it and kind of the attempts to govern it without really understanding that there are a few key players in tech, right? And so if you think about those with the resources to really kind of push the boundaries, historically, right? This is kind of contested now more so, especially this year, but just like kind of going back. Think about this, you think about kind of the resources needed. These are energy intensive, and we were talking about kind of global South countries, interest in AI, but then again, if you're thinking about the water resources that data centers would draw on many of these countries, there are trade-offs there in terms of kind of already kind of countries confronted with desertification, right? Thinking about kind of the environmental consequences of this, and the kind of the question of whether or not we're going to see kind of those countries that have kind of the AI hardware and the capacity to kind of lead in AI being kind of those that are kind of already wealthy, and instead of this being an empowering tool, potentially one that it's one that is deepening inequality. That being said, right, Medlir brought up China. There are other examples as well, right, where a lot of assumptions about just how much computer processing is needed, right? How powerful of chips are needed, sorry, are things that are increasingly under challenge. And you see this with, like, if you think about one governance regime that we haven't talked about at all today, is you think about export controls, right? And you think about kind of drawing up regulations to prevent the most high-powered chips from being exported to kind of countries that are kind of seen as adversaries. But at the same time, if you get kind of just downgrade just a little bit, you're not actually changing much, right? So and a lot of the problem is software, right? And that's something also is how do you control software? A lot of these tools that are being created are actually being created in a very kind of transnational space, since transnational spaces like GitHub and others. So yes, I think that the question of inequality is definitely there, and it's definitely something, but it's operating kind of at slightly different levels. I think in relation to, and also I like the question also because the assumption is that the human might be is better, right, and the person with the AI is the one that's losing out. It might actually be the reverse, right? That the those with access to kind of the most sophisticated tools, right, are those who are kind of wealthy, and those who are not are left with kind of the next best thing.
Yeah, and thanks for the question, David. Very, I think it's thought-provoking. I have a couple of reactions to that, and one of that is that I think, and again, think about my genesis about how I got involved in this. I think that countries that do not engage with it will end up being will lose out. And then again, your question is, well, what if you can't get there? I had actually a very interesting conversation. This will actually come out as the second episode. I think comes. We just recorded it just this last week, having a conversation with somebody who advises companies and entrepreneurs to labor costs and everything else. And this gets to your second question as well about a non-human future too. But um, his I asked the question about the resource intensive nature of this, which means then, some may actually miss out on the benefits of an AI future, so to speak, AI centered future. And I think part of it is that his view is that increasingly we're going to see this cost go down. And just like with other technological revolutions, I think Arnaud pointed to this, that we are going to find efficiency gains. And he pointed out the fact that he was able to do within 1 day's worth of work, something that would have required a team of maybe 5, 6 people about 3 months. Now, of course, that points to efficiency gains, productivity gains, but it does also point to this superfluous nature then of human-centered labor, because you say, well, wait a second, what's going to happen to all of these people? And we tend to have this view that, well, something will come up, right? We have this very optimistic view of it. I think that especially in developing economies, where again I have this personal investment in it and interest, I think that there are a lot of benefits to the uh, to bringing AI in. I mentioned earlier that I said something about AI-centered futures. I don't think we should actually build an AI-centered future. We should build a human-centered future where AI then enables us to do the things that we want to do. But this, of course, runs into resource, intensive nature of these kinds of technologies. There, I'm perhaps a little bit of optimist because I think that we are going to find solutions to them. In the meantime, however, we are going to have to think long and deep about these questions about environmental degradation and resource intensive nature of it, as Chris pointed out. I want to make one last comment about this idea. We tend to sometimes, and we do this on conversations on climate change as well, on sustainable development goals. We tend to ask too much of developing countries and say, well, you need to sit this out because it's not good for humanity. And I think that if you were to actually go to Africa, if you were to go to other kinds of parts of the world, where in developing parts of the world, there's a desire and a thirst for actually bringing these technologies into these areas. Again, going back to the UN summit back in September, I attended this big meeting where there were different representatives from various African countries and NGOs and everything else, and they were eager to bring the technology into Africa, but they were insistent on making sure there was AI for Africans and by Africans, right? But there was a need for financial investment. So at the UN summit, there was actually one of the documents that came out was that there was a commitment on the part of all countries to make this technology available, right, to the developing world. That was actually one of the big achievements, I'd say, of the Summit of the Future. So I think it's important for us to have this very complex kind of like approach to this. On one hand, recognize that this can discriminate against developing countries. On the other hand, we recognize that developing countries want it and they need it to be able to develop. And for us not to have this attitude of saying, well, this is not good for you because it's going to be so resource intensive, and therefore sit this out because it's not a good way of doing this. So that's kind of my reaction to that.
Excellent. That's very, very helpful. And with all your sort of case studies and empirical examples, it really helps us better understand some of these questions, and to sort of dig a little further into sort of these governance applications when we think, and this is another question of one of my esteemed colleagues, Alfredo Toro Carnevali, who is a political scientist, but has also worked in the diplomatic field at the UN. And so in that sense, the question here is if we're pushing towards or we are in a regulatory winter, right? And the norms building is a bit left to its own devices in terms of sort of state or international organizational structures, then that leaves our private sector, those firms and technology-driven enterprises, joint ventures that might set the tone here, right? And so how might this then affect the development and use of AI, Alfredo asks, for our societal development? And I might add here, because that was one of my questions, and it fits nicely with what Alfredo was asking, is in what case, what role do then citizens play here, right? As you said, the Africans at the UN summit said, like, we want this technology, but we want it to be included, right? To what extent is it then also accessible, right? Might come back to e-government, right? To what extent does it become more participatory nature? And if it helps negotiation practices, will the lawmaker or the legislative realm look differently? So this is like an extension to what Alfredo was saying, but maybe start with sort of the role of the private sector here, and then lead into sort of the broader society, civil society, but also citizens per se. Want to go ahead, Chris, and then.
Right. Well. So this reminds me. In not too long ago, we interviewed Maritya Shaka, who is an MEP, who's written a book called The Tech Coup, which focused exclusively on this question looking at the kind of the influence of large private actors, and also the influence they wield over states, right, and over regulatory authority. As I mentioned earlier, kind of this information asymmetry can be very powerful, even when there is a will to regulate, which, as Medlir has nicely kind of stated, is something that's quickly dissipating. So in the absence of that, you have a number of different frameworks. If you look kind of OECD and you're looking at kind of best practice principles, you're going to see different cultures of both AI and regulation emerging perhaps at the state level, because there's still a lot of movement there within states.
Right.
And what this will reflect and what the impact on societies are going to be. I think that's really interesting. And I think one helpful way to illustrate that is to get into the second question, which is how to use it in the classroom. And what does this mean for the classroom, and what does this mean for universities? And also, we've had a number of discussions. In fact, Medlir and I, we organized a panel discussion kind of looking at kind of artificial intelligence in higher education in particular, because there's kind of this kind of moment of almost kind of existential panic, right, when a lot of these LLMs first kind of were unveiled in a reaction, in a sense, where there was an attempt to just kind of like stamp them out or exercise them from university spaces. You have kind of all these AI detection kind of tools popping up that are actually kind of all right, but they're probabilistic like AI. So if you don't understand how AI works, you're not going to understand what your AI detection tool is telling you, which means that it's very important in the classroom today because of these broad societal effects, and because also AI is part of pretty much everything we do. In fact, from the kind of, it's changing how we kind of look for information on the web. It used to be that you would just get a Google search result that would kind of be kind of the searches, search websites listed in order. For people who are going to digital marketing, you'd be thinking about search engine optimization, right? There's an entire kind of entire kind of field of practice that emerged around that. That's also how tech firms monetized, right? Also by kind of offering kind of placement in these searches. But now, of course, you're beginning to notice that kind of generative AI is beginning to take the place of that. So in addition to the search results, kind of at the top, you're starting to get kind of paragraphs of text. And as that begins to shift, it's very important for those who are going to be going out into the world of kind of either kind of business or kind of politics or kind of any other field, to understand one, what that information is, and also to be aware of something that we haven't really talked about that much, although we've kind of alluded to, biases, right? Different types of biases that are inherent in these types of outputs, right? So how LLMs think, how they produce outputs, and thinking about prompting, right? And there are entire new fields that are emerging around this. You think about like things like kind of website coding as well. It's not just like research papers and stuff like that, where students are looking to AI to transform how they go about the research process, but kind of website coding, right? Being able to like prompt the AI to produce kind of what you want is something that is important, but it also will highlight the limitations, right? And I think the more that students understand that, the more that students are less likely to use these tools in a way that we would not want them to, or in a way that would be completely unethical, right? So kind of the acknowledgement of it, understanding it, but not kind of trying to prevent students from using this. They will be using it, right? You see in the workforce, businesses are using it. It's everywhere. So to understand the limitations and understand the biases that are inherent in it, especially for those going into policy, right? If you're using an AI tool that is involved in governance, as we've seen in places like in the Netherlands, sometimes biases can manifest in a way that would target marginalized communities. And if you don't understand, or you don't have an awareness of this, then it makes it more difficult for one, you to respond, but also in a way at the design stage to think about how to design things that would mitigate these biases in the future.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me kind of like share with you how I think in terms of kind of how we standardize ethical principles. Chris talked about human dignity, the importance of autonomy, sustainability. We discussed this, justice, inclusivity, privacy, data protection, accountability, right? Fairness, non-discrimination. These are, I think, when we look across the world, actually, these topics just keep coming back. It's the same ones over and over and over. Of course, some cultures and societies will have different kind of perceptions of what those mean and interpretation of those particular principles. But for the most part, we kind of know what the ethical kind of flooring in a way for building governance with regards to AI is or ought to be. I also don't want us to kind of leave here with this impression that because we are in this governance winter in a way right now, that there is no governance, right? There are a lot. I mean, every day I wake up and actually I don't want to open my LinkedIn account because I just get overwhelmed both by the amount of research that is being done on with regards to governance. That's like the number one, I would say that most research aspect of AI is AI governance. So when and if countries are ready to implement this, either globally, regionally, or locally, there's a lot of rich material there. So that's important, number one. So there's a lot of academic research. But second, there's a lot of also international and regional collaboration when it comes to AI governance. Now, it may not be as stringent as we may want it to be, but there's a lot of that, right? And this is not just in the global north, it's also across the global south as well. So I think it's important for us not to underestimate how much, right, of this. And there's a consensus, for example, the OECD AI principles, there's a general consensus that those are universally kind of accepted one. Religious organizations, because I think David mentioned the faith-based kind of approach to that, he meant it differently, but religious organizations are also very much involved. The Vatican very much involved, I think, in terms of getting involved in these conversations, interfaith debates and discussions. I was in Brazil just last year for the Interfaith 20, so on the sidelines of the G20, and where they were having these conversations, and they are concerned about the impact of AI on marginal communities, marginalized communities, and everything else. And so there's a lot of interest and a lot of input and engagement in this area. So while we are in this kind of like, as we mentioned, regulatory winter, I still think there's a lot of good work that's being done and a lot of different frameworks that are being proposed that eventually are going to kind of get to kind of a Pareto optimal kind of, stable outcome where maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but eventually we're going to get there. So I think that's a very important thing to think about. Now, your question on the public engagement and transparency, right? Again, this is not an either or kind of situation. So, you can have governments involved, you can have international organizations involved, and you can have also the public sector involved. And I don't think we need to cede the ground here just to the big tech, and we haven't. We had, again, a fantastic conversation with representatives from make.org, which is using AI to bring citizens in France, in Germany. I think in Belgium, there were a few other cases that are looking to expand in other parts of Europe and also the world to use AI as a way of bringing the citizen into the conversation and having that then impact decision making. Now, of course, the important part of the conversation here that was also part of the question that was asked is AI literacy that Chris pointed out. And I am in complete agreement. I remember having this conversation back, I think, Chris, 2022, perhaps, ISA conference. This is one of the first things that 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 we brought up at the International Studies Association. And I remember at the time everybody saying, well, we can't make this part of the curriculum. Like our departments don't want this, the university will not support this, and so we just can't have it. And so my suggestion at the time was, well, I mean, I'm doing this as part of a senior seminar, special topics, you can do this. In my university where I'm right now here, we are discussing creating labs which are after hours kind of discussions, so students do their work on their own and then a professor can actually facilitate that conversation. This is not for credit, but you are actually providing training for students for AI literacy, right? And so I mean, obviously we need to build this into schools K through 12, And we need to make sure that we have. So I was looking this up. I think there have been some fantastic ideas in this direction. So it's important to have AI literacy practices in place. This should involve data privacy and security. We often think of AI as this kind of like this sci-fi thing, but at heart, AI is about data privacy and data security. That's what it's about. That's where actually the rubber hits the road for most of us, right? And most people. Information and misinformation, all right? These questions of, as Chris pointed out, do we trust information or not? How do we detect false information or partially correct information? And then we need to instill, as part of this AI literacy, questions of human judgment, as well as centering justice within this human judgment, right? We make sure that we're ethical and we're fair in this. And then we need to make sure the third step of this, and again, this is not my thinking, there's a lot of people have done research on this, that we play with and we interact with, and Chris pointed out the idea is that we need to integrate this into our classrooms, right? And so in most of my classes that I teach, I have a week or two where we talk about, for example, if you're an upper division class, researching with AI. So how do you use AI to research, to prepare outlines, perhaps to help with footnoting, to identify potential areas that you have not. And I think, and this is my last comment here, academia has to really catch up with this. Somebody pointed this out actually on LinkedIn, that they had actually been very transparent with the journal, that in the process of coming up with this particular article, the writer interacted with AI to come up with ideas like, what are my blind spots? What are some of the things that I haven't thought about? What are some other things that you think about? And the journal just completely rejected the article right away, even though there was no evidence that the article was written with AI. But rather than in the brainstorming process, right, the author was very transparent about using AI to come up with ideas. I think that's wrong-headed. I think that's completely upside down. And I hope that academia eventually will catch up with this. And I think it will, because it's impossible for us to continue and pretend, right, that in fact, this AI will have no play in our creative process. I think we should encourage that, but we should have AI literacy at the foundation of that.
Excellent. Thank you so much to the both of you. I love how we came full circle. It's all about educating and making this tool an integral part, that technology of our societies, with certainly the guardrails in place, and the common sense about having it as an instrument and not something that replaces us, right? I think that we still have a human-centric environment in that we thrive. And again, it was such a pleasure having you. And there's so many more unanswered questions, but we can certainly share the information. I mean, I think your bio links are on the web. So if anyone wants to contact you, they should certainly do so. And wishing you the best of luck in terms of steering sort of the governance or governance with AI. And it was such a pleasure, and be well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.